You're listening to RTÉ Lyric FM. This is Composer Lab, and we are live here with you from Studio 1 in Dublin. The RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra are in front of me. Conductor Gavin Maloney is on my right, and we have 5 composers: Daniel McDermott, Peter Fahey, Kerry, Hagan, Sam Perkin, and mentor Dave Fennessy. And yes, we'll be talking to all of them. Now, there's new music, and then there's the newest music, and that's what we have for you tonight. 4 world premieres, 4 voices, a quartet of approaches to the greatest instrument of them all, the symphony orchestra. So we begin with Daniel McDermott and his new work Ratio. Firstly, Daniel is here with me. Congratulations, Daniel, for we have something in step with 2019, with tightly channeled passion that carries the promise of speaking to listeners well beyond our remit. For me, this piece has a cool, unsentimental clarity, tremendous rhythmic drive. But what was your inspiration for this work, Daniel?
So the inspiration kind of comes from seeing composition as an act of vandalism, of taking conventional melodic ideas and crashing and banging and walloping them throughout the orchestra and destroying melodic fragments within the orchestra, and the piece progressively gets more and more violent as it progresses and louder climaxes.
But there's mathematics at work here as well, correct? Ratios.
Yes, so ratio is in reference to the repeating 3/4 time signature against a 2/4 time signature, and it also references the structure of the piece, which has certain sections which move in big blocks throughout the actual composition.
And what about the process of its composition itself? Because it sounds real easy and it's an earworm for all of us listeners, but I'm sure you had several nervous breakdowns along the way.
Yes, certainly tearing my hair out over many weeks writing it. So a lot of my ideas kind of come from improvisations at the piano and then seeking to make them a little bit crooked throughout the instrumentation, taking that idea of almost vandalising the material.
So you're writing at the piano?
I do write at the piano.
The old-fashioned way?
Yeah, I actually improvise. I do a lot, and I would record them on my phone and then keep them as a kind of a drawer to open when I need stuff.
It's a very assertive piece. It's jarring. It's almost disturbing. As people will hear in a moment, the strings and the brass have wonderful workouts and build a mood of tension and anticipation. But rather than crash into total disruption and total chaos, although there is violence in it, the piece changes, at least to my ears, into an exploration of various rhythms. And is that what was one of your impulses?
Yes, that's once again kind of got to do with the ratio idea of having certain rhythms colliding with each other and then at the end resolving and fading away almost to a Charles Ive-esque coda.
Well, here was something to look forward to. Thanks very much, Daniel. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have Daniel McDermott's Ratio with the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra and Gavin Maloney conducting. Daniel McDermott's Ratio, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, Gavin Maloney conducting, and the first of our world premieres this evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I was talking to Dave Fennessy, one of the composers, and that piece is a kind of an earworm. It gets in on you and you can't get it out of your mind. We're moving to another piece which also plays tricks or gets in on the mind, and going there, I'd like to quote from Orson Welles' great film Citizen Kane. Mr. Bernstein, at the very beginning of his memories of Kane, says, "A fellow will remember a lot of things you wouldn't think he'd remember. You take me. One day, back in 1896, I was crossing over to Jersey on the ferry, and as we pulled out, there was another ferry pulling in, and on it there was a girl waiting to get off. A white dress she had on. She was carrying a white parasol. I only saw her for a second. She didn't see me at all. But I'll bet a month hasn't gone by since I haven't thought of that girl." Glimpses, memories, the reframing of memory. We're now moving to Peter Fahey's To the Woman Going Up the Escalator at Columbus Circle at 5:30 last evening. Peter is here beside me. Peter, good evening.
Hello.
Peter, that is a very arresting title, to say the least. Where did you get that from?
Well, I can't claim full credit for the title. So the title is actually borrowed from a poem by an American poet named Andrea Cohen. And it's an interesting connection to make with the quote from Citizen Kane, this idea of glimpses in memory, because the poem, which is quite a short poem, it takes the form of it's sort of like a personal sad, when these missing connections, personal sad. And what I've tried to do in the piece is just capture some of the, I suppose, the feeling of the poem, or the character of the poem, and I've also tried to incorporate some of the imagery somehow into the piece. And I suppose one of the most obvious images that I borrowed from the poem is the escalator that's mentioned in the title of the poem. And so basically the piece, it lasts about 8 minutes, and it's basically 8 minutes of ascending chromatic scales. Yeah, more or less.
The word for this is shepherd tones, isn't that correct? And I mean, we've heard them before, and most of the time they can be rendered. Jean-Claude Risset, the great electroacoustic composer from France, from IRCAM and stuff, he was great at this. But most of them would render them in electronic means or electroacoustic means. But you've done it.
Yeah,
for the orchestra.
I've tried to do it with just acoustic instruments, and I should say I haven't been too sort of scientific in my approach. Really what I've tried to do is just to create the general impression of continuously ascending, of the music continuously ascending, sometimes descending, and I've applied then the principle of the shepherd tone to other parameters of the music. So later on in the piece, I tried to create the impression that the music is continuously ascending and speeding up at the same time. Actually, just to explain a little bit about the shepherd tone illusion, it's analogous to the optical illusion created by a barbershop pole. So if you look at a barbershop pole, it's got that iconic red and white stripe pattern. And when it's in movement, it appears to be continuously ascending. In fact, it's just going around in a circle. And you can create a similar sort of effect in sound and even in music.
Well, you've certainly done it here, and that's the technical side, shall we say, because intellectual constructions, as we all know, exist in scores and in music, and that's fine, but they're not the sole meaning of the work. And the reason I say that is because for me, listening to this piece, you're positing, I should say, and investigating emotional states in the listener. I mean, we were in the control room earlier for the rehearsals, and we were very shook by some of the emotional states.
Yeah, I think when you write a piece of music, you're always trying to create a sort of, a musical experience for the listener. And part of that involves, there's an element of manipulation to it. And in a way, I'm trying to trick the listener. That's part of what's happening here. And an interesting thing about working with these shepherd tones is, because we all hear music a little bit differently and sound differently, it's like a magic trick. Some people will fall for it and some people won't.
But it's there all the same. It's there, Peter. I mean, you have to write a sequel.
Okay. Yeah.
But listen, thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks very much, Bernard. Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Fahey's To the Woman Going Up the Escalator at Columbus Circle at 5:30 last evening, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, conductor Gavin Maloney. To the woman going up the escalator at Columbus Circle at 5:30 last evening, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, Gavin Maloney conducting Hans Zimmer, Eat Your Heart Out, There's a New Kid in Town. Good composers borrow, great composers steal. This is a quote variously attributed to Stravinsky, Picasso, Joyce, Eliot Stern, and so on. Now, this could probably get us in a lot of hot water with the hot water police, so don't take it out of context. We are not advocating plagiarism. We are discussing methods and approaches to composition and art. And despite the publishing industry and software designers' best efforts, there is no reputable The Orchestra, a user's manual. Doesn't exist, thank God. But thanks also to the Contemporary Music Centre, CMC, we do have a mentor in composer Dave Fennessy. Dave is here. And Dave has worked with a variety of ensembles, and I think he at times needed all of that experience for these 4 different approaches tonight. Dave, what are your thoughts on the 4 approaches this evening, first of all?
Hi, Bernard. It's kind of incredible what 4 different people can come out with, which is ostensibly the same commission. To have really 4 different approaches to, as you call it, the instrument, but also taking everything from their experience, their music experience and their life experience, and everything that leads up to that moment when you put the first note down onto the page. And what really strikes me about the pieces this year, especially for some reason, and sometimes you get that, you get a kind of, there's a vibe in a group, and there's, you know, we're all there in the booth listening, and there's certainly a kind of camaraderie there, and there are certain points of crossing, I think. And one of them for me really is this idea about what they bring in from the outside, the real world, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, there's certain energies and symmetries which were in some ways accidental and yet fearful symmetries, as Adams and Ives would probably say. But, you know, Mahler once said that only when I experience something do I compose, and only when composing do I experience anything. And I'm just wondering, for emerging composers facing the great instrument of the orchestra for the first time, or for an early time at least, is it as much about learning how to define your own creative problems? This is for the composer, as it is for working with section leaders or conductors or even mentors.
The mechanics of writing for orchestra are huge. One of my heroes, Harrison Birtwistle, once said, you know, it's all detail. Writing for orchestra, it's just amalgamation of detail. And there's a certain element of truth in that, I think. So you're confronted with tiny details. It's like stop motion animation. It's like making an 1.5-hour stop motion animation movie on your own. And you have to build it up dot by dot. So it's easy to get bogged down in detail. And my role in all of this was that when we selected the composers, that these were 4 composers with distinct music personalities. And my role all the way through has been to try and reinforce in them the belief that they can bring that uniqueness to the sound world of the orchestra. And I think they've succeeded.
What would, you know, your role as mentor you've mentioned, would you have any other advice for young composers? Because unfortunately we do have to leave Studio One later on, ladies and gentlemen, and we do have to go off lyric and stuff, so going forward for them.
I think, well, I don't know, I'm not really one for doling out advice. There's several people who might be balking at the idea of me being a mentor to anybody. I think that certainly these 4 composers also would really, these are quite well-regarded composers too. These are not out of high school composers. You can hear that. This is proper stuff, you know. They know their way around the orchestra. They know what they want to say. They know how to do it. Really, for me, it was just a question of kind of hopefully instilling some kind of belief that it's worthwhile doing it. I think there's maybe a type, or there are composers out there who think that maybe the orchestra isn't for them. And my kind of mantra with this, a lot of the way through the 4 years that we've done Composer Lab now with the Symphony Orchestra and with the Contemporary Music Centre, is to say you can still do new, interesting, relevant, fresh things with the orchestra, you know, and come on in, the water's fine.
There's no sharks.
Well,
No sharks.
maybe
Not tonight, anyway.
those little ones biting and you know.
They're piranhas.
Yeah.
I suppose in the end, Dave, it's the power is in the asking the right questions of oneself and the creative process. And I think we should really bring our next composer in anyway, Kerry, Hagan. And did you know that Van Gogh, by the way, once said that I'm always doing what I cannot do yet in order to learn how to do it. So it's a very interesting way of approaching things, probably why he cut his ear off, maybe. But anyway, with that in mind, with two ears, that is, we turn to Kerry Hagan's Agus Iaba, As She Drowned for symphony orchestra and electronics. Now, there's little that is fixed here. Kerry, the map is not the territory. Is that correct with this one?
The map is not the territory. I'm not sure I understand the metaphor.
Well, looking at the score with you earlier and looking at some of the pure data parts for the electronics,
right, yeah.
and they open up and they can tell us things, but then you hear it and it's like it's completely different.
That's actually quite nice to hear. I think some of the best music that I enjoy listening to, you can't see in the score. You have to experience it. The hardest thing about writing for electronics in an orchestra is the notation. So you do your best to sort of use notation in a standardized way to suggest what the electronics are doing. So in that regard, the score can't really let you know everything that's happening.
Yeah, but you've taken a slightly different slant, because technology, as we both know, I think most of us will know, can digitally sample rich acoustic sounds, and it can play them back on a keyboard, and you can play them at various pitches and stuff, and that's fine. But there's a certain Xerox quality to this. It's fixed to a degree. It doesn't have the flexibility. It doesn't have the humanity of a player. Your electronics, and as I say, the score is for orchestra and electronics, not orchestra with electronics. The electronics are a performer, if you like, or musician.
That's right. The electronic part in this work is live. It requires a trained musician to perform it, following a score and a conductor, so a classically trained performer. And the sounds themselves are created in real time as they're happening. They're based on recordings of the Shannon River, which is what the title comes from. Agus Iaba means as she drowned, and it is a reference to the myth of the Shannon River, of Shannon and her death and subsequent drowning that formed the Shannon River and infused the region with life, gave it the fertility and life in the area. So the electronics themselves are live. The performer is adjusting the level, the attacks. It's not recorded, and in the same way that the strings have a role or the percussion has a role, the electronics have a role that's no more or less important than any other section in the orchestra in that regard.
The word that came to mind when I was listening to this piece from an earlier workshop performance at the National Concert Hall was delirious. A certain delirium of large shapes and alternating sections, as we'll hear from the orchestra in the wild. I know you were talking to me about some of the inspiration coming from the various, let's say, mythical or whatever, religious origins perhaps in the Shannon. Were you playing on all of them and positing them to today? Because there are certain feminine archetypes at work here.
Right. The what I found really fascinating about the Shannon myth is that depending on who the storyteller is, slight changes in the story reveal more about the storyteller than the story itself. So there's some really interesting Marxist and feminist and sort of religious readings of this myth, how it was told before, pre and post-Christian rule in Ireland and everything like that. So that also attracted me. But the piece itself is not programmatic per se. It's a series of fleeting impressions, allusions to not only the myth of the Shannon and that story, but also the sounds of the Shannon. Limerick is my home. I love my home, and I was inspired by the sounds close to home. And the river is a part of my life. I live in the city centre and I work at the university, and the river goes through both of that, and so it just just seemed to me an obvious, the piece almost came out, it wrote itself practically with that. Yeah.
Well, will you please go to the control room, because you're going to help with the supervision of electronics, and we'll move towards the piece. Once upon a time, ladies and gentlemen, the composer was a performer, and then Beethoven came along and turned that all on its head, and that at its worst leads to the ivory tower, where the composer is the composer and doesn't look down on you mere musicians here in front of me. And gradually that has shifted again, thankfully. So with Kerry Hagan's Agus Iaba, As She Drowned, the wonderful RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra here, and Gavin Maloney conducting. Another very powerful piece tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Kerry Hagan's Agus Iaba, As She Drowned, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra here in Studio 1 in RTÉ in Dublin. Gavin Maloney is conducting it. Until the advent of electronic sound, the closest thing we had to a universe of possible sounds was this body right in front of me, the orchestra, large group of instruments capable of creating a wide range of timbres. But today, electricity is fiction, and the best of the electronics can rival anything. That said, Kerry has just shown us the human element, and the naturalness of so-called acoustic sound still has its own magic, and combining these two realms therefore seems at times to be the best of both worlds. And that is something that our next composer, Sam Perkin, has also done in his new piece, The Orchestra in the Digital Age. Hi Sam, how are you?
Hiya.
So the first thing I want to ask you, Sam, and I have so many questions to ask you, I'm sorry, but I'm going to ask you just one, and then we can go through all the questions at once. That's some going, ladies and gentlemen. So a sine wave is said to be the most basic sound. I think most people will agree with this. Therefore, it's called a pure tone because it contains neither overtone nor noise, but a single frequency. It's essential. It's an essential part of your piece. Why?
Well, when I was starting to write this piece, I was thinking about the orchestra and the fact that the orchestra is one of humanity's greatest achievements, and we live in a digital age. So I was experimenting a lot with these sine tones, which are these very pure type of tones. And what happens when you blend an acoustic instrument with a sine tone is that it makes the acoustic instrument glow. So with this piece, I really wanted to make the orchestra glow in a new type of light.
Well, you've done that because we've been listening today in rehearsals. Now, Sam, as I said, I've about 9 questions. So I'm going to roll them all up into one because you and I were chatting. So here is 9 questions rolled into one. What are you exploring here? Are you out to get some ideal balance between the electronic and the orchestral parts? And we're bombarded by technology, as you've already alluded to, even in the room here. So what does it mean to work with the orchestra in such a world? Now, you wrote down a few points. I don't know if you want to go through them.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, a lot of the main priority with this piece was blending the orchestra with the electronics. So a lot of the musical material is, pretty much all of the musical material is the same as the material in the electronic part. So they're very synchronized. That was the key to this piece. So the real artistic goal was to have a piece where you can't really distinguish whether you're hearing the orchestra or the electronics. And during the rehearsals, I think it's sounding fantastic. I think it's working. So it's a pleasure to kind of hear the orchestra with this glow created by the sine tones, these really pure tones. As I said, just trying to explore new directions, and the orchestras continued to never cease to surprise us throughout the history of music. So I just wanted to try and explore this direction.
Holograms keep coming to mind. Blade Runner. This is what I'm keeping when I'm listening to this piece. that kind of not quite world, netherworld almost, but wonderful. It's bewitching. But Sam, you have a lot to do because you have a lot of supervising of electronics and to do. So would you please go and do that, and I'll tell people what I think is coming up, and then we'll hear the piece.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. So just to because we've heard this piece, we've been lucky, ladies and gentlemen, but most of our listeners haven't. So if you play a sine wave with a frequency of 440 hertz, all of the orchestra go, "Oh, yawn, Bernard." But we will most likely perceive A. And that, as Gavin well knows, is the tuning standard for most modern orchestras and instruments. However, that A will not sound like an A played by an instrument in the orchestra. So if you took a harmonic analysis tool of the sound of an instrument or the human voice, and if you use them as the input sounds, it would break the input into sine waves of many different frequencies. So we have rainbows of sounds and artistic choices. So that is what I think Sam is starting to explore here. It makes for tremendous engaging listening. Sam Perkins, The Orchestra in the Digital Age. That was Sam Perkins, the orchestra in the digital age, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, Gavin Maloney conducting the fourth of our 4 world premieres. And now I'm going off script to say how really inspired I am to hear 4 great pieces, 4 wonderful approaches. My ears are buzzing, my mind is racing. I'm not going to sleep for hours. Thank you very much, RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra and Gavin and Elaine. So, go back on script. Okay. So our composers are here. We're just going to ask a few more questions and then let everybody run off. So I have, instead of asking you who's going to stop Manchester City, what star sign are you born under, anything like that, I will ask you, and answer when you feel like it, what was it about Composer Lab, the scheme itself, that made you apply? Anybody?
Well, one
Peter.
of the things about the program that appealed to me was the way you could develop a piece over time. So we didn't just show up, in an afternoon and pieces were rehearsed and then performed. We had the opportunity to develop pieces over 6 months or so, and so we had workshops with the players, and then a big workshop with the full orchestra, and then we got to go away and work on the pieces some more. And I think that's a rare and valuable opportunity for composers.
It's a great process. You know? Another question that comes to mind is that working with an orchestra through the conduit of a conductor like Gavin, is there a strict division of labour? I mean, because these are your babies that you have to let go of to a degree, or is there an element of collaboration right up till the end? Anybody?
For me personally, there was a great deal of collaboration all the way up to the end, because I had to add a performer to the orchestra. So they've been very well. The orchestra's been very welcoming in allowing us to integrate, and that, as Peter said, this constant working. It's just wonderful to have the first rehearsal after meeting with the orchestra before then. You're so used to coming in, fait accompli, score here, do what I say, but rather there was a nice give and take with the principals, and all the way up to the end. Yeah,
It's a process. Sam?
Well, working with Gavin has been fantastic. He's just so solid.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. For my money, the best conductor on the island, by the way. But anyway,
Absolutely.
go ahead.
But everyone involved, really, the Contemporary Music Centre, we have to thank the Contemporary Music Centre, and the engineers as well.
Yeah.
Of course, the orchestra. Just everyone involved. It was such a pleasure. So I just wanted to say thanks.
One of the things I was talking with Daniel about was that working with a body of players, the instrument, the orchestra, can give you 5 nervous breakdowns, several trips to the dentist, all these things because you're pulling your hair out and you're readjusting everything. How did you find the process, Daniel?
Well, a big thanks to Dave Fennessy for holding my mental health together while doing it. So he was really, really great over the whole process.
Well, I think it's been an extraordinary hour. Before everybody goes, though, I do have to thank people, and this is really important because at times we forget to thank people who actually make all this happen. And I know they know who they are, but it's nice to tell them who they are. So here we go. Acknowledgements. Our composers, Daniel McDermott, Peter Fahey, Kerry, Hagan and Sam Perkin. Our composer-in-chief, mentor Dave Fennessy. Dave is here somewhere. The RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, of course. Elaine Clarke, our leader. Conductor Gavin Maloney. Our tone moisters, our masters of sound in the back there, Mark Dwyer and Dave Gibson. Yvonne Ferguson and all at the Contemporary Music Centre, and especially Keith Fennell, who basically is the atlas who lifted this project on his shoulders for months. Anthony Long, and Anthony's here somewhere, and all at the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra. Our streaming crew, who are around, John Bates and his team, and Peter Curtin, who's in Limerick, holding it all together for us there. Aidan O'Doul and everyone at Performing Groups and RTÉ Lyric FM. And finally, to you, because without you, this would not happen. It's as simple as that. And by the way, although we're standing in Studio One, we're coming to you in the greatest concert hall in the world, your radio. So, over to my good friend Vlad Smiskevich in Limerick for the rest of the Blue of the Night. Ladies and gentlemen, we've a hoolie to go to. Thank you.